Welcome to the Zabars podcast. I'm your host, Willie Zabar. I'd like to start by dedicating this episode to my aunt Lori Zabar, who passed away this February. I can't begin to describe what a loss this was for my family and our community. What I can do, though, is tell you about her passion for history. She was a master of uncovering obscure information and translating it into terms us non-historians could understand. Lori spent these last 5 years writing a book about our store called Zabars, A Family Story with Recipes. It's equal parts historical text and memoir. Luckily, she was able to finish the book and take an active role in planning its release. One of her ideas was to make a special episode of the Zabars podcast to promote the book, so here we are. And to be clear, my goal isn't to make a long advertisement. Yes, I hope some of you decide to pick up a copy, but this episode is more about honoring the work my aunt put into researching and recording our family history. I hope this will also serve as a companion piece to the text, offering supplemental material to those who've already read it. So, enjoy this mix of book excerpts, original interviews, and rare audio recordings as we delve into the Zabars story. Part 1. The early days of the store. To recap, Zabars is currently owned and run by my grandfather Stanley Zabar and his older brother Saul. They're the two eldest sons of our founders Louie and Lily Zabar. We covered the story of how my great-grandparents came to America and started the business in episode 3. As part of that, I recorded an interview with Aunt Lori back in March 2021. Only about a quarter of that hour-long conversation made it into the final product, so I've decided to share more of it here. Here's Lori speaking about our family setting up shop on the Upper West Side.
Louis, he always was in the fruit and vegetable business. And then in 1934, he heard about a counter that was available to rent on the Upper West Side between 80th and 81st Street. And he decided that he would leave Brooklyn and leave the fruit and vegetable business and go into smoked fish. And then Louis and Lily were doing well enough. At one point, the owner of the store decided to sell, and Louis bought the store from his original landlord. So anyway, they moved to the Upper West Side from Brooklyn. They lived in a couple of apartment buildings, and eventually they ended up at 219 West 81st Street, which is that white brick and terracotta building. It's between 81st and 82nd Street on the east side of Broadway. You've seen it a million times. This was in 1938. They had really made it.
Here's a story about Saul and Stanley growing up in that building from the official audiobook, read for you by Erin Bennett. Just a note, the book is written in first person from Lori's perspective.
If they forgot the key to their apartment, they could always walk a half block over to the store where their parents were working. But the boys came up with a much more creative approach. They'd knock on their next-door neighbor's door, and from the neighbor's balcony, they could shimmy onto their own balcony and then slip into their apartment through an open window. My grandparents never knew about this innovation, which was probably for the best.
I sat down with my grandfather to ask what it was like reading tales from his childhood all these years later. There's a story about you and Saul climbing through one window to get back into your apartment. What was it like reliving those memories?
Well, that was very interesting because I realized how scary it was. We were in full view of, you could see Zabars from the window we were living in. But we didn't think very much of it in those days, when we were 7, 8, and 9 there. Didn't think that we could fall down, but although it was a narrow balcony.
Here's a passage on how young Saul and Stanley spent their time in the store. And just a little background. At this point in history, New York State still had stringent blue laws limiting business hours on Sundays. From page 40.
Saul and my father were still youngsters then, but they pitched in on Sundays too. Because Louis kept the store open beyond permissible hours, one of Saul's duties was serving as a lookout for police officers who patrolled in search of blue law violators. Other times, he tended the dairy counter, selling sour cream and sweet cream by the dipper, and cutting thick slices from blocks of butter.
I knew that Grandma Lily had many responsibilities at the store, but I learned a new one on page 47 that took me by surprise.
A woman of many talents, Lily had a particular aptitude for law enforcement, serving as Zabar's one-woman security force. If she spotted someone stuffing a can of peas or a bag of coffee into his jacket, Lily had no qualms about confronting the person and giving him a good talking to. Rarely did she need to summon the authorities.
Fun fact, Zabar still uses Lily's gefilte fish recipe, which you can find at the end of chapter 10. I never knew Louis Zabar, but Lori's writing gives us some insight into what he was like as a person and his philosophy of business. On page 74, I learned that Great-Grandpa Louis's professional slogan was,
"The highest quality at the lowest prices."
Even today, my grandfather Stanley Zabar strives for the same.
We find the best at the most reasonable price.
Saul, Stanley, and eventually their youngest brother Eli continued to work at the store in different capacities over the following years. While Louis and Lily focused on developing the business and opening new locations, the older Zabar brothers began planning their own futures. None of them could have predicted that the store and their lives were about to change forever. Part 2, The Rise of Zabars. To kick off this section of the episode, here's more from the Lori interview.
Louis got sick, and so he died at the age of 49. And Saul, who was 21 at the time, or 22, he took over the running of the stores, even though he had never planned.
Really?
Saul had never planned to run Zabar's. No, he felt that he was obligated to keep things going because my father's 4 years younger. My father was still in college. So Lily asked Saul to work and try to keep things together. And my father was in his second year of University of Pennsylvania in the Wharton Undergraduate Business School. So she asked my father to transfer to NYU.
Really?
And come back to the city to help Saul. Yes. So the two of them, like 22 and 18, were running the store. So the stores, because there were more than one. So they really had a lot of responsibility at a very young age.
Wow.
And Saul had always said he wanted to be a doctor or he wanted to be this or that. And
really?
he thought he was just there temporarily.
The store continued to build a small local following through the early reign of Saul and Stanley, but it didn't hold anything near the amount of prestige it does now. I knew from my own research that Zabar's received almost no press coverage in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. As I went through newspaper archives, I noticed a greater volume of stories about us starting in the early 1960s, and then a full-on media explosion in the 70s. Through reading the book and talking to some of the people who lived it, I was able to piece together some of the reasons Zabar's gained so much popularity in such a short amount of time. The first person I asked was Uncle Saul, who was perched on his iconic chair at the front of the store by the registers.
Who's this guy?
This is Henry. He's a good friend of mine. He does the audio for the podcast.
Oh, yeah.
And then this is Emily. She's
What is a podcast? I don't even know what it is.
It's like a radio show. We did last year. We made a few. We interviewed you for them. People liked it. You listened to it.
I did?
Yeah, you liked it. When do you think Zabar's became cool?
I don't know what that means.
Like hip,
I don't
fashionable.
know what that means. If Zabar's is cool and fashionable, I have no knowledge of that.
Whether or not he'll ever admit it, Saul deserves much of the credit for the store's rise to prominence. Here with more is Lori's daughter, Marguerite Zabar Mariscal. From the book.
By the early 1960s, Saul was focusing his energies on one store, Zabar's on 80th Street and Broadway, and now he had the time to do something that he'd been thinking about, adding new offerings to the old classics. Business administration may not have been his forte, but Saul did have a sense that the gastronomic times were changing and that what his customers wanted was about to change too. Saul's timing was perfect. An increasing number of Americans were beginning to travel to Europe as commercial transatlantic flights became more available. And when those people returned, they wanted to buy the foods that they've been introduced to overseas. And so Saul began to import a range of condiments, all kinds of oils, vinegars, mustards, honeys, and spices, from England, France, Ireland, Italy, Australia, and the Netherlands.
Saul's experimentation with new products coincided with the beginning of what's now known as the culinary revolution. It was around this time that he began roasting coffee, a product which remains a cornerstone of the business. Here's Stanley with more info on his brother's role in those critical years.
You know, Saul, my brother's going on 94, and he's here almost every day. I don't know, maybe he doesn't have anything else to do, but there. And he watches, and he's the one who developed the coffee We went once to California, and he met somebody who was roasting his own coffee, and he realized it wasn't difficult and he could do it. And he taught himself the roasting of the coffee and how to buy the best coffee. And so it's over 50 years he's producing a coffee that he considers like a fine wine there, and how it's to be ground and how we ship it and we send. So we are producing somewhere near or roasting somewhere near 8,000 or 9,000 pounds of coffee.
But what's Saul really like as a person? Even though you've heard from him throughout the series, there's a side of my great uncle that not everyone gets to see. Here's longtime employee Adela Palmer with more.
I work with the accounts payable department, and I'm also Saul's assistant.
How long have you been working here?
Oh my gosh, 35 years.
Wow. That's awesome.
I like working with numbers. I like calling my vendors. Yeah. And believe it or not, I like to deal with Saul. To me, it's like a challenge. Yes. Yes. And I mean, I love that man. I do. He's awesome. Very smart man. If you really get close to him, he has a beautiful heart. He does. He has a beautiful heart. You just have to understand him.
Here's master sandwich maker Akhtar on Saul.
Saul has a heart for his employee. I miss my parents in Bangladesh, but when I see Saul, I don't miss anything.
Saul's efforts would soon pay off as Zabars quickly became a shopping hub for prominent New Yorkers.
By the mid-1960s, Zabars had become a fashionable place to shop for both gourmet offerings and traditional Jewish appetizing and delicatessen. Actors, musicians, and intellectuals who lived and worked nearby, as well as neighborhood residents, congregated at Zabars on the weekends to socialize while stocking up for Saturday and Sunday brunch. Saul had another reason for all this updating. He was hoping to sell Zabars and wanted to make the package as attractive as possible to potential buyers. He had given running the store his best shot, but despite the enticements of the expanded gourmet offerings, the profit margins were extremely narrow, and expenses were still higher than income. Zabars was losing $200,000 a year. My uncle and my father realized that they could not keep Zabars going by themselves. So they appealed to Murray Klein, who had left their employ in 1957, to come back and help them turn the business around.
Here to read from the book is Lori's son, Henry Zabar Mariscal. Here's more about Murray from page 106.
Saul and Stanley succeeded in getting Murray to agree to return to Zabars, where he was put in charge of the day-to-day operations, opening up the store every morning at 6 a.m. 3 years later, he became a full one-third partner, a stocky, balding man with close-cropped graying hair, heavy-lidded green eyes, and a thick Russian Yiddish accent. Murray often sardonically referred to himself as a peasant, or as one of the proletariat, in contrast to the Zabars, who he called Jewish royalty. But ultimately, it was working-class Murray who rescued Zabars from the financial ruin and transformed the store into what it is today.
Here's Murray in his own words.
We're at Zabars on Broadway near 80th Street, and we're with co-owner Murray Klein.
In 1950, I got my first job at Zabars as a delivery boy on Broadway. And I take care of the people because I'm one of them. I don't think you're going to see another store like Zabars.
This next clip is from a 1975 reel-to-reel audio tape I had digitized. It features a young Stanley Zabar discussing the store's newfound success with a TV reporter.
Business has never been better. People are coming in more often, maybe buying slightly less each time, but they want to treat themselves.
This tape shows how our store went from nearly going under to thriving under the supervision of Mr. Klein, even during a recession. Now let's hear from people who knew Murray. Here's Zabar's general manager Scott Goldshine on his predecessor. What was Murray like as a person?
One of the toughest SOBs I've ever met in my entire life. He came from the Ukraine, I believe. He had family. He was in a displaced persons camp. He lost all his family. He was incredibly tough. It didn't matter. He was in a car accident once. He was in the store the next morning in a wheelchair with 2 casts on an arm and a leg. And 10 minutes later, I had to pull him off a delivery man that he was getting into a fight with. That was the best way to describe Mr. Klein. He's the one that basically hired all the old timers that are here, the managers, the older managers. He was the one.
Here's my grandfather's take on Murray.
He was tough, strong, fair, and he was always worked very hard. And each person had their own knowledge. Saul was particularly knowledge in the smoked fish and the caviars and certain other things. Murray was in the housewares and the cookwares and other parts of the operation, but he also put together a very strong operational store.
Lori also went on to quote Murray as saying,
"If I walk out onto Zabar's floor and I can see my shoes, it's not busy enough."
Here's my brother Danny speaking on the Murray era.
I think the 1970s really changed Zabars. I mean, both from a brand recognition standpoint, from an operational standpoint.
Zabars continued to gain popularity through the rest of the 70s into the 1980s. Murray Klein brought the store even more attention through a series of highly publicized price wars. We don't have time to cover them in this episode, but it's all in the book. As we move on from the Murray Klein era to the modern day, we're going to focus on an iconic employee whose career spanned both. I'm talking, of course, about celebrated fish slicer Sam Cohen. Here's more from Henry, from page 95.
Few employees exemplified Zabars as it was from the 1950s through the 1990s, like Sam Cohen, a Holocaust survivor of slight build, great charm, and considerable intelligence, who was hired in 1953. Clad in a white coat, he would take his place behind the appetizing counter, where he masterfully sliced lox and smoked salmon 60 hours a week for 46 years. Zabars was Sam's stage, and the customers were his audience. He flirted with the women and kibitzed with the men in Russian, Polish, Hebrew, Spanish, and English.
Here's a recording of Sam from the Zabars archives discussing a caviar shortage.
Sam Cohen is the caviar expert here at Zabars. Is this disastrous news for those who love caviar, the shortage?
I would say yes, because people who like caviar will go a long way to get it.
Yeah.
Especially the high-quality caviar.
For more on Sam, here's prominent fish slicer Len Burke.
I was waiting on a customer, and the customer said, "I want a 1/4 pound of Nova, but not over." So I sliced it, put it on a scale, and it was a point or two over. So I was about to take off a slice, and Sam Cohen said, "What are you doing?" I said, "The lady only wants a 1/4 pound. This is a slice over a 1/4 pound." He says, "You never take anything off. You give it to her, she'll take it." I said, "But she told me specifically that she didn't want more than a 1/4 pound, and I don't think I should give her more than a 1/4 pound." And Sam Cohen said to me, "Well, you may not be wrong, but you're not right either." I'll always remember those words. One of his favorite sayings was when he sliced the salmon too thick, because he was not a thin slicer. He was a thick slicer from the old school. And when he sliced it too thick for the customer, and that happened quite often, he'd say, "Take another man."
Some people have described being a counter person as kind of being a performer because you're talking and you're saying things to the customers all day long. Would you agree with that?
Sometimes. Sometimes I feel like I'm working, and sometimes I feel like I'm playing. When I feel like I'm playing, that's fun.
Here's Scott with more on Sam.
Sam was a lot of fun. He actually had 2 roles. In addition to being at the fish department, we used to be open till midnight on Saturday nights. And at around 6 or 7, I would clean all the money out of the registers and put them in a brown bag and escort Sam upstairs to the office. The store was laid out differently, obviously. And Sam was a bookkeeper. Customers loved him. There was always a line of people waiting for him. Even when he got older, when maybe his slices were a little bit thicker than perhaps the others, nobody cared. He was one of the nicest men I ever met. Just a great guy.
Part 3, The Future of the Business. Now that we've looked back at the legends of Zabar's past, I want to share some of Lori's writing about the key figures of today and the likely leaders of tomorrow. From my 2021 conversation with Lori.
As you know, my brother, your father, has been working there many years. And now some of the next generation, like you and your brothers.
Yeah.
So we're at a time where there's a real transition.
Stanley and Saul are still very much in charge of the business, but as time has gone on, new leaders have risen through the ranks. Here's more from the book.
Although they are both in good health for men of their ages, the question becomes more pressing with every passing year. What is the future of Zabars? My brother David, now 65 and the store's executive director, has had many roles at Zabars and knows the business from all sides. Along with the store's longtime dedicated management staff, David will be the link between the old regime and the new. Aaron Zabar, Saul's 48-year-old son, has also been with Zabars for many years as a front-end manager and will also be part of the family's transition to the next generation.
Here's a rare 1996 recording of my father, David Zabar, discussing changes in food trends.
At this time, the biggest trends was prepared foods, dinners that people can come pick up on a daily basis. They're always looking for something new. What people were eating in restaurants the last 2 or 3 years, they want to make at home. And I think the stronger flavors lets them get away from the fat, the oil, the salt, all the things that you're not supposed to eat these days. Vinegar is very big. People are going away from the oil and towards the low-fat flavorings. Along with coffee, we've had a phenomenal growth in loose tea. People want to try a different tea every week.
We can't talk about the current state of the store without reflecting on the role of Scott Goldschein. As general manager, he's responsible for all day-to-day decision-making. He answers only to Saul and Stanley, so in their absence, Scott is in charge of the store. Here's a bit about Scott from the book.
Scott has seen it all since he started working at Zabars in 1977 at age 17. Over the years, this lifelong New Yorker and chief troubleshooter has managed almost every department, including housewares, grocery, coffee, and front end. As general manager, he presides over his staff of 230 in 7 departments with a calm and cheerful demeanor, and he maintains personal relationships with the store's many suppliers and tradespeople. Scott appeared in You've Got Mail as an extra, and to this day, he smiles when he overhears customers talking about the movie.
What was your first job here?
Garbage.
Garbage. How did you like that?
It's great. It taught me how to be humble and how to treat people, that's for sure.
You want to talk a little bit about You've Got Mail?
That was a bit of a struggle. Nora Ephron, who lived across the street, was a regular customer and wanted to do a scene in the store. Convincing Saul was a massive, massive undertaking. He just didn't understand any of it. And it was a huge shoot. Most movie shoots or TV shoots have to be done at night because we do not close the store, period. But this was probably the biggest thing that we ever shot here because they wanted a store full of people. And they had to be out by 6 o'clock the next morning. So we had negotiated a price with them. And there was a $5,000 penalty for every 10 minutes that they were late past 6 o'clock. And I was obviously here. And amazingly so, 5:55, they came to me and said, okay, we're ready. Go take a look and see if we screwed anything up. They were out by 6. It was a ton of fun. That was a huge bit of publicity for us. There are people to this day, every week we get people that come in and say, is this where the cash only line was? Or they all ask about the movie. Still, and the movie's 20 years old or something like that. I've known the Zabar family since before I started to work here. And I'm here 44 years. So in many ways, I'm part of the family, which means I can get yelled and screamed at like they do, and vice versa. I have had massive screaming matches with Saul and Stanley over the years. I've quit 5 times on Saul. Each time he runs down the block and tackles me. And eventually it's okay.
This is a good time to start talking about the family dynamic. Here's my brother Danny again.
I mean, one time I got into a tiff with the general manager and we had a big blow-up fight and he sent me home early. Not a big deal. I've been fired many times from Zabars. And somehow they keep rehiring me, even though 90% of my resume just says Zabars on it. And I think that night was Passover or Hanukkah. So I show up at my grandparents' house, after this big, troublesome day at work. And the first person to come up, I hadn't even told my parents. I hadn't told anyone, this thing happened. My grandmother comes up and just pats me on the shoulder and goes, "Don't worry, everyone gets sent home early. It's not a big deal." I mean, my grandmother knew about my fight at work before anyone else did. So it's hard to separate, to turn your business brain off when you're dealing with family, because they're also your bosses and your coworkers.
I included this bit to stress the fact that we're still very much a family business. Everyone from my generation has worked at the store at one point or another. Towards the end of the book, there are some great photos of us all in our work uniforms. As we wrap things up for today, I want to share a clip from the end of my 2021 conversation with Lori. We had finished the interview, but hadn't cut the microphones yet. So what you're about to hear is completely candid. I can't think of a better way to show you what she was really like. Aunt Lori, thank you so much for doing this. This is great.
You're very welcome. And so anyway, there's lots more details in my book. And obviously I can't give you all the details because I have to save some things for people to discover.
Oh, of course. And we'll cross promote. We'll promote this book.
Yeah, I would hope so.
That brings us to the end of our episode. I'll be honest, this was not an easy one to put together. When I started out, Lori was still with us and available to help guide me through the process. She really only had one stipulation. Don't give away all the good stuff. She'd repeat this every time I saw her. Luckily, the book has so much good stuff, I couldn't fit it all in one episode if I wanted. One of the main reasons I started this podcast was to preserve and share my family's history. Little did I know, Lori was quietly working towards the same goal on a much more impressive scale. I don't know how many people will listen to this, and I'll never know how many will go on to buy the book. But what I do know is that no matter what happens, people will be able to find my Aunt Lori's book in libraries, bookstores, and living rooms for generations to come. And if they choose to pick it up, they too can learn our family's story. That's all for now. I'm Willie Zabar, and I'll see you at the store. The Zabars podcast is produced by Emily Cherish with sound editing and mixing by Henry Butler. All funding made possible by Zabars. Special thanks to my family, the workers of Zabars, Penguin Random House, and most of all, Aunt Lori. May her memory be a blessing.